Grüß, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 7 of my Wargaming Rules Review series. In this video I'll provide a brief overview of the Empire 3rd edition rules, which was printed in 1981. I still vividly remember when these rules came out and how excited I was. The basic premise behind these rules is excellent, which put players into the place of divisional or brigade commanders, with players being able to form up the subordinate formations into the correct historical layout to attack or defend. However, after several weeks of trying as hard as I could, I simply could not get a game from the rules. These rules were an attempt to move from an element maneuver-based set of rules, such as WRG rules, to a formation allocation set of rules where players maneuver elements into an optimal attack position and then let loose with the assembled attacking force in a fixed or semi-fixed formation manner. Writing rules for such a revolutionary game system was never going to be easy, and it was not. The rules are 53 pages long, but you also need to cross-reference another dozen pages. The rules themselves are an awkward format and are not conducive to cross-referencing rules during a game. In the end, I had to give up. It's possible these rules, once you understand them, are the best things since sliced bread, but the effort involved in learning how to play was this difficult. They were destined to fail. The only way I could say that they would succeed is if you had someone that already knew how to play the rules teaching you. On the other hand, in defense of the rules, the basic philosophy of the rules is brilliant, and creating a set of rules which can be learned and are playable using this idea would be a real holy grail, which I must admit now 20 years plus after the Empire 3rd edition came out, I did make an attempt to do myself. In the meantime, Empire 3rd edition is best learnt from an experienced player. However, with sufficient effort, you can learn these rules and have an enjoyable game, but I must warn you, it does take quite a bit of effort. Within the rules, this chart in particular excited me, showing the divisional, brigade and regimental zones and how they relate to each other. This strongly reminded me of a table in the Prussian 1812 field manual showing how brigades needed to be deployed, in that particular case for attack. The basing, which was not uncommon for the period, is rather flexible and is dependent on the actual historical formation. In this case, we see a French Ligue or Légère infantry battalion of 12 figures. Each figure has a frontage of 3/8 of an inch, or for 15 mil. So a 4-figure element is 1.5 inches wide, and a half element is 6/8 of an inch wide. If using metric, each 15 mil figure has a frontage of 1 centimetre, so a 4-figure element is 4 centimetres wide. If we're looking at a French infantry battalion of 9 figures, it has this arrangement. This represents a significant amount of detail, which I have to admit was common for the period, but certainly not for today's rules. As is my normal practice, let's now look at the sequence of play. The publishers have created a nice flowchart, which in principle is a good idea, but in practice wastes a lot of space within the rules. Both players issue operational orders to corps and maneuver elements. Both players attach any leaders to a maneuver element. Both players declare all operational orders. Both players then attempt to activate maneuver elements which require activation. Moving down the chart, both players now conduct strategic movement. When we move into tactical combat, a sequential system is now employed, but the order is mixed and is based on initiative. This is an attempt to simulate simultaneous movement without the issues associated with simultaneous movement. Both players now conduct bombardment. Both players determine if leaders are wounded or killed. Both players then recover fatigue points, and we now end the hourly round and move into the following round. This is a very well thought out sequence of play, even if a little bit complex. This is certainly a strength of the rules. Now we come to, unfortunately, the less attractive aspect of the rules, the orders. This shows a flowchart which is an attempt to make the complexity of the order system more understandable. In case you do need this flowchart in order to understand what you're able to do or able not to do, and I have to admit, in most cases, you do need this flowchart because otherwise you will miss a rule. Unfortunately, one of the negatives of this sequence of play, which is kind of designed to simulate quite a large force mix, as I normally play at clubs, I need a game which can be played in under 6 hours. Thus, I rarely field more than one core. So most of the complexity that you saw previously never really applies. So maybe it's not such a bad thing if you want to stick with small games. However, when I got Empire 3rd Edition, I wanted to field multi-cores. This is actually a common issue back in the 1980s. Many different rules attempted to allow players to field larger formations than normal, but failed to make the rules simple and quick play enough to achieve this. One of the other real strengths of the rules is the command and control. There are many different leader characteristics, from inspirational impact to professional skill. I must admit not agreeing with some of these classifications, but I have to commend the effort to go to that level of detail. Back in the 1980s, few rules attempted to provide players with that level of historical information about commanders. These rules are in many ways a strategic game where players strategically move formations around until they are in a position to attack enemy formations. Once players have completed the strategic element or strategic movement, they then move into a totally different game, the tactical combat phase, which also does involve movement. It's not just combat. Unlike strategic movement, tactical movement is highly restrictive. Players need to make sure they line up their formations carefully so when they conduct tactical combat, they can move into close combat in the most efficient manner possible. This was one of the elements of the rules I particularly liked until I started reading all the restrictions associated with achieving this. When we form our formations, units are considered to be frontline or non-frontline, which affects what they're allowed to perform. Very logical. It's critical to get your formations correct when you engage the enemy, otherwise you'll find your units at a severe disadvantage against that enemy. The tactical combat rules represent an enormous portion of the entire rules book, and players need to carefully read all the restrictions carefully as they are significant. A lot of effort has gone into getting this level of tactical combat as historically accurate as possible, and you can really see that in the tactical combat rules. As can be expected, in order for players to understand what they can and what they can't do, a flowchart is provided, which I can assure you is needed. Another interesting point about the rules, a significant focus on skirmish combat is included, with the flowchart providing players with assistance when skirmish combat is occurring. Once again, additional complexity. You do need the flowchart in order to understand what you can and what you can't do. Let's look at an example, actually an example that comes out of the rules. This shows the opposing side at the beginning of the tactical combat phase, with opposing base lines 8 inches away from each other. Side A wins the first tactical initiative impulse, but does not elect to utilise skirmish combat in this case. So we're not going to go through the skirmish combat sequence of play or flowchart. The player controlling Side A selects the 1st Battalion of the 33rd Regiment to move and fire. Side B's Unit B1 may return fire only if it first passes any morale tests caused by or created by casualties sustained by enemy fire. Player A then selects their 2nd 33rd to move and fire, but instead of moving the entire battalion, he elects to only move the skirmish company screening the parent battalion's front. This moves and fires by skirmish company represents the entire move and fire of the entire battalion for this impulse. Of course, Unit B2 may return fire into the skirmish company of the 2nd 33rd if it is eligible. Now we'll conduct some artillery fire. This shows that the foot artillery company unlimbers and fires. After that, the horse artillery is selected for action and moves, that's on the right, unlimbers and fires. Assuming Unit B3, that's the enemy, passes any morale check created by all this artillery fire, it can return fire into the horse artillery. Player A now decides to launch an attack against B3 and selects his entire regiment, the 15 Légers 2 Battalion, for this action. Assuming that after B3's defensive fire, the result of the alarm test for the 15 Légers was to halt at 2 inches and fire. After doing this, player A must now select a unit for tactical action and decides to change the formation of some of his non-frontline units. The units that he selected to change formation at the bottom left. This shows the change of formation, which means the tactical impulse for that particular maneuver element is now exhausted. The tactical combat phase contains all fire combat, melee combat, most artillery fire, and gives you an idea how important this phase is. The tactical combat section takes up 40 pages. This is about half the rules books, excluding the appendixes. These rules have a major focus in terms of historical detail, complexity and accuracy, and players who like that level of detail down to battalion level would be very much attracted to these rules. Prior to me purchasing Empire 3rd Edition, I was a WRG musket and pike gamer, so the idea of moving around 12-figure battalions was not new, although the basing was an issue for me. In the end, I simply used WRG basing with Empire, as I had no intention of rebasing my force mixes in order to suit Empire, and for a large extent it generally reasonably worked well. When I started playing Empire 3rd Edition, or at least I attempted to, I loved the detail and the basic two games in one concept, strategic and tactical. However, as I normally played at a club for a maximum of 6 hours, the strategic end game ended up being not very useful. A typical game would quickly result in both forces coming into contact with each other, and then while for reserves, strategic movement was still useful, the game quickly moved straight into the tactical combat phases. I must admit the complexity and historical detail did not bother me at all, but for the first few games it was a real struggle to ensure I got all the rules correct. Often a game would quickly get bogged down into a find out what I can do in the rules type argument or discussion. This got better after several games, but I'm certain that myself and my gaming comrade got many aspects of the rules wrong, and we often would discover that we'd done something really wrong in a previous cycle or phase, which would have dramatically affected the game to a point where what we were doing made no more sense. In the end, we gave up, which I found sad, as the basic strategic objective of the rules was exactly what I was looking for. That was my opinion. Let's look at some other players. Another player provided the following comments about Empire 3rd, which I generally agree with. He claimed the good aspects are as follows: the idea of simulating history, even at the expense of the game; the way in tactical combat you have to keep the pressure on or lose the initiative. On the other hand, the list of bad things is much longer. A short version is as follows. I've excluded what I consider pedantic bad things. The first is the extreme complexity of many subsystems that in the end didn't give a commensurate return in accuracy and realism. Percentage multiplied by decimals, multiplied by numbers, by guns, figures, etc. really was too hard for most people to handle. Elan flowchart was, I think, a bad idea as well. Another negative was far too many troop morale grades. I'm not 100% certain if that's really such a bad thing, but nonetheless, it did make what was already a complex system even more complex. And another issue, a clear bias in the way some armies were portrayed. It's generally accepted that the French should get some form of advantage, but it goes far too far in these rules. Other negatives were being able to fire infantry skirmishers and even cavalry and keep the initiative. This allowed players to mess around, wasting time and boring the other player to death. I would want to replace all this with a kind of skirmish combat or attrition combat. Another negative was awful convention game. If you didn't know the rules going in, you are completely stuffed. Rules lawyers absolutely proliferated with these rules. Time and patience. Empire is incredibly slow and it takes dedication to understand the rules and tactics. I removed all the, general player preference point, which varied by player and only listed the basic game mechanics, which I think are the main negatives. I have to point out, Empire 3rd Edition is not the end of the line. There are possibly more, there is possibly the more commonly used Empire 5, and there are rumours of an Empire 7 coming out, which may be a lot better, although I must admit I've been waiting for Empire 7 for about 3 years. And so this concludes episode 7 of my video series on rules review, in this case providing a brief overview of Empire 3rd Edition. Alle guten Dingen kommen zu einem Ende.